Good evening, everyone. My name is Jasper Bors, and I'm the events director of the Buckley program. For those of you who have not been to a Buckley program event before, the Buckley program is dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and the free exchange of ideas on campus. We do this in a variety of ways, including hosting firing line debates, seminars, lectures, and our annual fall conference, which will be on November 1st this year. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to thank the Irving Brown Lecture Series of the Young Americas Foundation for making this event possible. And I'd also like to thank Carol Brown, who is here with us today, for her generous support of the Buckley program. Our guest this afternoon is Margaret Hoover. She is a best-selling author and host of SiriusXM's daily show, Get It Right with Margaret Hoover, which features pop culture, entertainment, and politics. A CNN political contributor, LGBT activist, and veteran of the Bush administration White House, Margaret is passionate about modernizing the Republican Party. In her best-selling book, American Individualism, How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party, Ms. Hoover challenges the GOP to modernize in order to connect with the millennial generation. She is currently the host of Firing Line, a reprisal of William F. Buckley Jr.'s original television show. Episodes can be found on PBS. Ms. Hoover is the president of the American Unity Fund, an organization that works for full freedom and equality for LGBT Americans by working with conservative legislators and leaders. She also serves on the boards of Stanford University's Hoover Institution and the Hoover Presidential Foundation. Previously a Fox News personality, Ms. Hoover starred for 4 years on the O'Reilly Factor's highest-rated segment, Culture Warrior, and is a regular guest on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Daily News, the Daily Beast, CNN.com, and Fox News. And, actress Cynthia Nixon recently said that Margaret appeals to the pragmatism of the millennial generation. She believes constitutionally guaranteed rights ought to transcend left versus right and Democrat versus Republican, and she does so with savvy, skill, and style. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Margaret Hoover.
Thank you. Well read. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Are we on? Let's do a mic check. How are we doing? Can you guys hear me? Thank you very much for having me. I want to thank Carol very much for having me here and for sponsoring the Irving Brown Lecture Series with the Young Americas Foundation. I want to thank the Young Americas Foundation for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor, frankly, to be invited to anything at Yale that has Buckley in its title, because Buckley and the legacy of Buckley is something that I approach with trepidation and a great deal of humility, especially in the current context of my role in the reprisal of Firing Line, which airs on PBS here every week. This week, Michael Bloomberg is my guest. He actually just told me we're going to push out on social as soon as this evening is over. He told me yesterday as we were talking at this global forum that he hosts at the Plaza in New York that China doesn't have a communist government. And then when I really pushed him on it, he was like, well, no, but they have a constituency that they answer to. And it was all in the context of climate change, as though like the individuals and the people in China can speak out and their government will listen to them on climate change and change their climate policies. And it was just like a baffling exchange. So feel free to go on social media and like, tweet, retweet, push it out. I'm going to start with something that's maybe a little unexpected, which may be something you all know about or you don't know about. But there's a real through line from the political philosophy that I have adopted as my own, and which is an idea called American Individualism, which was basically a political philosophy that Herbert Hoover strung together at the early part of the 19th century, 20th century. And Hoover is my great-grandfather. I think I'm here to make the argument that he had a pivotal role to play and a foundational role in the creation of the modern American conservative movement and what laid the foundation for Buckley's convening of the great public intellectuals of the middle of the 20th century that led to the conservative movement, the modern American conservative movement, and then creates a through line to Firing Line and the work that I'm trying to do now. I learned about Herbert Hoover in school as the uncaring, not that involved president during the Great Depression. I don't know if the history books were much better when you guys were in 7th or 8th grade American history. Show of hands, is that basically the messaging you got? Yes, yes, okay, nodding, great. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of history curriculums. Most people know of him as the 31st president of the United States, the president during the Great Depression. They know the name Hoover was associated as a pejorative, right? Hoovervilles, Hoover as a synonym for bad times. What is forgotten in his 90 years of life and 90 years of history is 88 of those years, many of which were frankly marked by extraordinary feats in human accomplishment, unparalleled in human history, organizations at which he sat at the helm that have been forgotten in our history textbooks, and that absolutely should be part of our lexicon as conservatives in order to reach out and connect to a new generation. Hoover was born in Iowa in 1874. He is a frontier town. West Branch, Iowa had less than 600 people in it. His father was a blacksmith. His mother was a Quaker minister. You ask why were there ministers? I thought Quakerism, you just sat in a circle and everybody was quiet until the Spirit moved you. This is a branch of the Quaker faith whereby actually some people were moved by the Spirit more than others. And it just happened that his mother, Huldah Hoover, was moved so much by the Spirit that she was actually on a circuit whereby she would travel by buggy around varying villages in eastern Iowa, and one day came back with a flu that didn't go away, and it got progressively worse. And 10 days later, she passed away. Likewise, Hoover's father, a blacksmith, also came down with probably typhoid fever, leaving Hoover and his 2 siblings orphaned by the age of 9. And so Hoover was, with few resources, sent west to live with estranged relatives who he never talked about after he left, but it was in a small town called Newburgh, Oregon, and it was also a Quaker outpost. At the time because Quakers valued education so much, the community assumed he would go to a religious university or a religious college to further his education, which was the thing of primary importance. And Leland Stanford Jr. was starting a new university in California that had an interest in reaching as many students as possible in the West because it wanted to be a counter to the East Coast institutions. And so Hoover, while he didn't have the mathematic ability, frankly, he hadn't distinguished himself in, frankly, any of his academic pursuits, he distinguished himself to the advisor who is the admissions advisor who was seeking students in Oregon because he tried so hard with rudimentary math to complete geometry that she figured he'd be able to get himself through a tough curriculum. So he got to Stanford early to take classes in order to qualify to be able to be admitted and to take the basic curriculum at Stanford, making him the very first student to enroll in Stanford University. An enterprising guy, he had absolutely no resources. He, as I just mentioned, he frankly had to be entrepreneurial and look for ways to get his way through college, to pay for his lodging. He figured out a way to make both the baseball and the football teams profitable. And he is the only president, the first president, Gerald Ford is the second, to be admitted into the NFL Hall of Fame for his role in making Stanford football a profitable endeavor. He, besides that, distinguished himself in geology. After 4 years, graduated with a degree in geology, frankly, went into the Sierra Nevadas and shoveled ore at the bottom of a mine for 6 months, the graveyard shift, making $2 a week, until he got a big break to work for a mining engineer in San Francisco, who then gave him a big break to go to the outback in Australia to seek mining properties, to see if mining properties in Perth could be developed into profitable mines. Here, Hoover gets lucky. He's 22 years old and strikes the biggest vein of gold in Western Australia that continues to produce for the next 100 years. KKR, the major investment and private equity firm in New York, has just bought that mine. And it continues to be the largest open pit mine in the world. You can see it from the moon. Hoover developed it. It was the Sons of Gwalia mine. And he had such good luck and distinguished himself to his supervisors that they then sent him to China, where he developed mining properties on behalf of investors there and was among the last Americans and foreigners to be in China and was part of the last 137 of them that were part of the American and foreign encampment during the Boxer Rebellion. He escaped on a German mailboat with his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, who he had married in the intervening years. He sailed from Australia back to the United States, married her, they sailed to China, and she was the first woman to graduate with a degree in science, hard sciences and geology. They then spent the next 15 years of their lives on a steamship, between steamships and 4 continents, developing mining properties on behalf of European interests, mostly English interests. And this is important because Hoover has this ability to interact with varying levels of every country. He's interacting with the people who are on the ground, who are the miners. He's interacting with the governments who are offering the mining licenses and organizing the business interest. He's interacting with the business community. And he essentially, at this time, which is the beginning of the 20th century, overseeing a tide of revolution that is sweeping the world, frankly, where old governments and the old world and the old world order is changing, and a new bout of isms are coming into play. Bolshevism is rising, fascism, the monarchies and the top-down organizations for many of these governmental structures are being challenged, and Hoover's life essentially becomes this hands-on experiment with what systems of government are working and what systems of government are not. And he develops during this time a thesis about what makes the American system unique and why his experience as an orphan from eastern Iowa has allowed him to have this set of experiences and expertise when most people in the countries he's interfacing with wouldn't. Because of all this, Hoover finds himself essentially running his own consulting firm in London in 1914 when he's 40 years old at the outbreak of World War I. As you all know, the Germans invade Belgium. Belgium is an industrialized country. It imports 80% of its food. And the Germans don't believe that it is their responsibility to feed the occupied population. With 80% of your food being imported and an English blockade preventing any food from getting in, there is a dire situation because the country of Belgium faces imminent starvation. 8 million Belgians aren't allowed to receive any materials because of the English blockade. And there is this standoff between Churchill and the Germans because Churchill believes to expedite the end of the war, collateral damage will be 8 million Belgians. They will just have to starve to death. But for the fact that the United States was not in the war, and Hoover had already distinguished himself in an earlier crisis, getting Americans back to the United States who were stranded in Europe at the outbreak of the war, Hoover has the expertise to move massive amounts of materials around the world because he's been overseeing shipping between the 4 or 5 continents in which he's been a mining engineer. Hoover is enlisted and frankly volunteers himself to organize international humanitarian food relief to the country of Belgium and creates an LLC by which he signs away his entire net worth and far more than it, far in excess of it, that he will personally guarantee the delivery of food to the Belgian people starting, frankly, it began in September. In September, 40,000 tons of wheat were delivered. 80,000 tons of wheat were delivered in October, and every month after that throughout the course of the war. Hoover created an LLC called the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. Again, as an American, because Americans were in the war, he was allowed to do it, but he had essentially powers of immunity to cross both sides of the lines throughout the course of the war. They had their own naval fleet. They had their own power to negotiate treaties. They had their own flag. They had the ability to accept donations from multiple countries, and their responsibility was to arrange for the safe navigation of massive quantities of food through European waters, avoiding submarine attacks, and then arranging the complex logistics of unloading this food into Belgium, getting it onto barges, sending it through canals, delivering it to mills, dairies, and bakeries, where food was prepared and then distributed to the Belgian population, all while keeping it out of the hands of the Germans, and while continuing to have the trust of the English and the Allies. Throughout the course of the war, Hoover delivered and distributed materials to more than 2,600 Belgian towns and 2,100 French communities on the northern, caught on the wrong side of the lines. And this became the singular and the first administration of humanitarian food relief to an entire country in human history. Little known side story about Herbert Hoover. Because of this rise to prominence, and because Hoover is an American who's allowed to go on both sides of the lines throughout the course of the war, Wilson suddenly finds him enormously important. So when the Americans enter the war in 1917, Hoover is brought back to the United States. He, at this point, doesn't know much about his political philosophy. He has given one political donation to Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign. Wilson brings him into his cabinet as a wartime cabinet post, the food administrator, where he continues to oversee operations of food, the delivery of food, both to Belgium, but then in the aftermath of the war, to Russia, to Poland, and to sort of the frankly decimated communities throughout the war, throughout Europe. And is so popular that Wilson brings him to the Treaty of Versailles, to the peace conference, which was 100 years ago on June 30th. And Hoover predicts correctly that the reparations, the deal is, it's a bad deal, to use the language of our moment. It's a bad deal, that it's going to cause another war. The reparations are too harsh on the Germans. He attends the signing. He comes back. He's a popular member of Wilson's cabinet. So popular, Harding keeps him on, makes him Secretary of Commerce. And then he becomes part of Coolidge's cabinet. So all throughout this time, Hoover's developing this philosophy of what the proper interaction between the state and the individual is. And as Commerce Secretary, he does some pretty extraordinary things that are defined maybe by two words: activism and frankly growing the Commerce Department. Okay, not ideas that contemporary conservatives think are particularly conservative. You're great. You're growing a federal agency, and you're an activist. Fantastic. All right. So to put it in context, Hoover is a Commerce Secretary in the 1920s, a period of huge post-war booming and economic growth, a period where certain industries are coming into relief and to existence. New technologies are coming into usage. You have radio, you have television, you have aeronautics, you have the automobile. You had a massive sort of burgeoning of industry and new technologies and frankly, tools in individuals' lives that are elevating the standard of living for Americans everywhere. But there are problems because there is no standardization across many, many industries for many, many parts. For example, consider the radio waves aren't regulated in any way, shape, or form. So you have radio signals going all over the place. You have, frankly, parts to build a house, 2x4s, bricks. 2x4s aren't 2x4, by the way. They're just logs, they're just slates of lumber, and they're all different. Hoover views an opportunity for the government, and this is why he's ended up being called an activist. He views an opportunity for the government to be a convening power and to help make businesses more efficient by streamlining their processes. So what that means, the best example of this is standardization. When you go buy a brick today, they are all exactly the same size. They're 5 3/4 length by 3 1/4 height by 2.5 height, 3 1/4 long, right? That's the height, length, width. Hoover did that. Now, Hoover didn't do it because he said, here is what the standard, dairy, for example. You buy 6 eggs, 12 eggs, liters, gallons. Bed sheets come in twins, queens, kings. 2x4s are 2x4s. Automobile parts have a standard wheel, standard axle. Screws have standard threads, Phillips head, straight head. Hoover actually gets this reputation for being this convener of industry. And there's this sort of hit against him is that he has all these studies and he has all these conferences. But the philosophy is you use the power of government to convene industry in order to drive consensus. And that can then allow for efficiencies to make the marketplace take off. You end up having a housing boom in the 1920s because there became a standard model for a house. Many of these industries end up really soaring because of the efficiencies that Hoover creates, not by dictating from above, but by creating by driving a common consensus within the industry to standardize parts. He becomes, in 1928, the savior of the Mississippi River flood. In 1928, the United States experiences a flood through the Mississippi River Valley that far exceeds in the amount of its destruction anything in the contemporary day. It's the Katrina of the moment. And Coolidge doesn't want to deal with it. He asks Hoover to go handle it. And Hoover, in his entrepreneurial engineering way, is able to predict when the flood is going to crest in certain cities, constructs tent cities, administers vaccinations, delivers food, sets up canteens, and is able to bring relief ahead of time to the local municipalities, frankly, and also going and encouraging local municipalities to cooperate. Now, not all of them did. Many of them said, the feds are here to tell you to leave your house. But in most cases, there was cooperation. And he organized, and this is key, that the relief be entirely privately funded. He was able to leverage relationships with the Red Cross and private philanthropy, use the radio waves to go on and appeal to American benevolence and charitable instincts to help pay for the cost of the reconstruction and the decimation of the Mississippi River Valley. So while Hoover believes there's a role for government, he doesn't believe that government has to always pay, or that government always has the solution, or that government should dictate the solution to local municipalities. That the cooperation is critical, and that we all have a stake in it. So the tragedy of Hoover, as we all know, is that at the time he ascends to the presidency, he wins in a landslide larger than any landslide previously in American history, and is considered the most technically capable, operationally capable, internationally experienced, also a person with the highest business acumen ever to ascend to the presidency. He is untouchable. His reputation is completely untouchable. And of course, we know the tragedy is that the Great Depression strikes, the stock market crashes 6 months later, and a series of cascading events create the largest calamity in American history after the Civil War up to that point. How Hoover handles the Depression is a lecture in and of itself. My view is that economic historians and mainstream historians have not fully synthesized their consensus of what happened during that period, but we know a couple of things. We know Hoover did some things wrong, for sure, and we also know that we didn't have the tools and the knowledge that we've gained in modern macroeconomics because of what we've learned from the Depression. And that while Hoover made some bad monetary choices, or some bad fiscal choices, he brought all the CEOs in his convening power and asked them to hold wages steady. Maybe holding wages steady wasn't the right. He asked them not to lay off people. Maybe intervening in the marketplace so directly wasn't the best short-term or long-term policy. What we do know is the Fed was playing with monetary policy in a way that fiscal policy couldn't overtake. We had a massive deflationary period during the Great Depression. Everybody thought it was inflation. They tightened the money supply, which expedited the failing of the banks, both in the United States and in Europe. We also know that Smoot-Hawley which was the bill that Hoover signed because it was passed universally, it was passed overwhelmingly in the House and the Representative, which was a protectionist measure, which prevented trade from Europe. The effect of Smoot-Hawley is, if you ask Milton Friedman, vastly overstated. That because international trade was such a small part of our total economy, that it has probably been overstated in Harvard Business School case studies for decades. But what we do know is the Democratic Party spent more than $1 million to tarnish Hoover's name and tie him directly and personally to the Great Depression. And what I also know is, as an orphan that was probably, in contemporary parlance, raised in, we'll just say, very difficult circumstances with a relative that probably wasn't very kind. I think contemporary parlance would call it an abusive household. He lived under a stairwell. It was very Harry Potter. This is sort of a Horatio Alger story. What we do know is that he actually lacked the ability to communicate and connect with people in the way that FDR could. And so FDR was able to come in. He was able to institute these sweeping new policies, including the New Deal, and many of its subsidiary policies are all part of this package. And what we know is that didn't turn around the economy, but it made people feel better. And Hoover's, I think, inability to connect and communicate during that time certainly hurt him. And that the Democratic Party also paid a lot of money in order to directly tie Hoover to the Depression. This is where Hoovervilles came from. They were a project of a Democratic National Committee operative named Charlie Michelson to tie Hoover personally to the Great Depression, so that a Hoover flag was an inside-out pocket, right? The Hoovervilles were the tents and the newspapers. All this to say that something pretty extraordinary happened in the years after, when FDR was president and the New Deal policies were taking place. The economy tanks down again in 1937. It bottoms out even worse. And what we know now is that we didn't get out of the Great Depression until we got into World War II. But Hoover did something rather extraordinary during the New Deal years. In fact, the first year after he was out of office. And it's something that is really unprecedented and would be considered uncouth, to say the least, in our contemporary political moment. Current presidents basically have had the luxury of not having their successors or their predecessors say anything about what they're doing or weighing in on their policies, right? George Bush has stayed very quiet during the Obama years. President Obama has stayed thankfully quiet during the Trump years. And that has been a tradition that has basically been the case since, certainly throughout my lifetime. Hoover afforded FDR no such luxury. Hoover believed the New Deal was going to fundamentally change the relationship between the individual and the federal government. It was going to fundamentally capitalize on a trend that was happening abroad and overseas, where central governments were becoming empowered, were gaining more power and taking more freedom from their citizens. And so Hoover wrote a book called The Challenge to Liberty, and it became a bestseller. And in 1934, The Challenge to Liberty articulated exactly what the problems were with not just the New Deal, but with this philosophy of new liberalism that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats were promoting in order to do what he felt was expand the federal government in a way that would impede individual freedom and individual liberty in very basic ways and fundamentally change the relationship between the individual and our government. That was a long walk for this drink of water. This book, The Challenge to Liberty, written by Hoover, was the first conservative defense against the New Deal. And Hoover remained the one person who would go out and go on the airwaves and fight the New Deal and fight this increasing and ascendant liberalism that basically ran roughshod over our domestic policies up until Eisenhower was president. And it was that inevitability of this growing liberalism that was captured on the front of that first National Review, where Buckley is standing athwart history yelling, "Stop." So what I would pose to you is, through Hoover's challenge to liberty and his activism during the FDR years, he begins to lay the groundwork for what becomes the modern American conservative movement that Buckley really capitalizes on it and frankly convenes through his own intellectual rigor and through the convening of other public intellectuals in the mid-50s. And it should be known that it was in 1954, 1955 that Buckley went to the Waldorf Astoria in apartment 31A, where Hoover resided, to tell him that there was a real need for a conservative journal that could bring together conservative thinkers of its time and begin to lay an intellectual foundation to push back against the ideas of a strong central government that were impeding individual freedom. It is a small twist of fate. Actually, I'll get there in a second. As you all know, the ideas that, and the sort of three central themes, right, that brought together the modern American conservative movement were, as articulated by one of the conservative movement, I think's best historians, George Nash. They were Buckley's sort of traditionalists, the free market libertarians, and the anti-communists. Nash describes the conservative movement at its founding as a wide river with many tributaries. By the way, it's no coincidence that George Nash is also Herbert Hoover's chief biographer. The wide river with many tributaries essentially had these three tributaries, as we know, and it is sort of these ideas and the convening of these ideas that begins National Review and begins sort of this movement that Buckley then becomes the prime television personality of when he, 10 years later, starts Firing Line after his run for mayor in 1965. So Firing Line began as a little-known television program. While it was an instant success, it was also not widely seen. It started because Buckley ran for mayor in 1965, and his copy was so good. The journalists and journalists would just sort of rush around him on the street corners to take his copy, and every now and then they would have a camera. The camera would be an instant press conference, and the film would be an instant hit. So an enterprising television producer thought this should be a television show. And Firing Line ended up being, and don't let anybody take this away from Buckley, the longest running television show in television history hosted by a single host. He outdid Johnny Carson. And I think what Firing Line did then, for those 33 years, was provide a place, in addition to National Review, which was cerebral and a place for public intellectuals, mostly of the right, to publish, although Maury Kempton had a few choice columns. What Firing Line did was bring public intellectuals, political activists, people from popular culture, religious leaders, sports athletes, actors, comedians. I'm thinking Groucho Marx, Billy Graham, Muhammad Ali, and many, many, many others. Every Republican presidential candidate, most of them from the conservative movement and the Tories in England, to American public television in a way that allowed the public to engage with conservative ideas, but also not conservative ideas, to engage with socialism, to engage with, Buckley's very first guest was Michael Harrington, a socialist, an avowed socialist, who had written a book, The Other America, about poverty in America, who made the argument that the federal government should essentially end poverty by pouring, at that time, hundreds of millions of dollars in every year. It was no coincidence that when I relaunched Firing Line, our first program was a program on federal anti-poverty programs that Paul Ryan came to be the guest on as a counter-programming, and he got to respond to a clip of William F. Buckley and Michael Harrington talking about our federal anti-poverty programs. In a little-known coincidence of history, when Buckley ended Firing Line in 1999, he wrapped up the show, wrapped up the archives, and eventually donated them to the Hoover Institution, where the repository there is able to digitize the film, make it available to most of you. We have 300 of the original episodes are digitized, and you can go see them. And all of the transcripts are digitized, so you can see any program at the Hoover Institution's website, read the transcript, and see, frankly, many, many things about, I think, the evolution of Buckley over those 33 years, the evolution of the conservative movement, and the conservative movement's prominence within the context of the Republican Party during those years. So all of that is background to, I think, where we are now. And as somebody from the center right who feels connected and deeply loyal and humbled by, I think, the experience of the conservative movement, Hoover's connection to the conservative movement, and to the Buckley legacy, I think a lot about what Firing Line can do in this new movement, in this new moment that is, I think, captures a schism in the conservative movement. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that there are conservatives now who believe the conservative movement has never been stronger with the presidency of Donald Trump. There are conservatives now who no longer call themselves Republicans. They've left the party because of the presidency of Donald Trump. I think it's safe to say that the conservative movement itself has many factions and continues to have many factions. And what I think is there are ideas espoused by Hoover and by Buckley that fundamentally need to continue to have a home in a movement and in a party. And they stem from the essential three categories, I think, of the conservative movement as it convened in its beginning, which is the free market libertarians, the traditionalists, and the anti-communists. As I think about the threats on the horizon for this country, some of the old debates are new. We're talking about socialism again. As it turns out, there's a need to really engage with the new socialism and democratic socialism. And I think that debate, while we thought we've had it and won it, apparently isn't over. We need to have it again. I think what the challenge that conservatives face is to be able to update our terms and to make a case that's more compelling in a modern moment. And so I think of this old paradigm in the 20th century, which was the paradigm that Hoover and Buckley fought, this sort of centralization of a massive federal government that was all-knowing and had answers for every problem in American life, versus a smaller government, individual freedom, these arguments about what the right relationship between the individual and the state should be. That was a paradigm that I thought before this 2016 election was going to continue to be the paradigm that defined us. I think it's now a subplot. I think there's another paradigm we have to think about, which is this populism versus globalism. I think of this because I was on the stage with Mike Bloomberg yesterday, talking to him about some of these issues. But the truth is, Daniel Henninger wrote about this beautifully in the Wall Street Journal today. The defense of liberal democracy and the defense of a representative government is actually going to be one of the challenges, the greatest challenges of a new generation of conservatives. Because as George Will writes in The Conservative Sensibility, what are conservatives trying to conserve? We are trying to conserve the principles of the American founding. And there is a moment, and there is a question in this moment of angry populism and global elites that perhaps our representative democracy and our system of governance is not able to answer the challenges of our electorate and our people. Our Congress isn't working properly. We're not passing our budgets. We're not able to, frankly, do some of the things that we have said as conservatives we would be able to, we prioritize for many, many decades. The debt, just to name one example, has gone up $2 trillion in the last 2 years. And there's a question about whether democratic government is going to be able to function and answer the needs of its people. And this is against the backdrop of, call them globalists or just call them global elites, who look at China and they look at some of the more, what they think are efficient authoritarian systems around the world, and they think they're more efficient. And maybe we should follow that model, or maybe we should not follow that model and change our model, but maybe the American system just needs to be updated because its democracy is messy and not efficient. Okay, and against the backdrop of that, you have what Andrew Yang calls the fourth industrial revolution. What Andrew Yang is also referring to, you know, the guy who's running for president, who's never held elective office, but has a massive following and is on the stage of the Democratic candidates, what he's actually speaking to is that there is a technological revolution that does see AI coming, and that does see massive displacements of workers, and is beginning to be expressed, and it is part of the expression of this economic populism. So I think that there are, that our system is going to be in need of defense, and is going to be in need of reforms, frankly, that can demonstrate the wisdom of the founders, can remain relevant and practical for a new generation, that can push back against this sort of rising tide of recidivist authoritarianism that you see in China and in Russia, and offer solutions for a new generation of people that are coming up in a fundamentally different economy. And so I think as we think about a conservative movement that is going to appeal to a new generation, we can draw on the old ideas, which remain true, and update them in order to sort of to compete to the challenges of our moment. And I will just say there's one other piece of this, I think, that has been really instructive for me, because every week of Firing Line, we find a relevant clip from the original Firing Line to air in our program. And I do this editorially because I believe that you can learn a lot through historic perspective. And in some cases, Buckley changed his mind. In some cases, Buckley says fundamentally surprising and hysterical things. And in some cases, you can see that the left hasn't evolved or changed. They're making the same arguments. But I think the other thing that we're going to have to do in order to remain competitive in the realm of ideas is to take on the new challenges of the moment that frankly, conservatives hadn't really embraced before in a meaningful way in terms of policy. I'm thinking climate change. I'm thinking of the new prism of the way race and ethnicity is conceived of, and the legacy of slavery in this country, and how this plays into our contemporary understanding of race relations. I think there are issues that are not issues that conservatives necessarily hung their hat on, but that can have a conservative sensibility and a conservative approach in order to also compete in this area of ideas with a new generation. I found some fantastic Buckley quotes about the environment and about race that are surprising, and I think it's just worth remembering that conservatism, while I think Will is correct. It's a sensibility, but it's not a straitjacket, and it has to be considered in a way that that can evolve when new information is available, and can take into account new facts, and can change its mind over time, as Buckley did, frankly, about race relations in the United States, ending his life by saying that he believed that Martin Luther King Day should be a federal holiday, after initially having been not just a dissenter of Martin Luther King, but rather conservative when it came to some of the early legislation around desegregation and the South. So with that, what I think I'd like to do is turn to questions and have a back and forth with the audience. And thank you all very much for being here. That was so much longer. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome to choose
I mean, I'm happy to call on people. Go for it. You. Allison.
We're just going to wait for this.
This is Allison Carroll's daughter, who has a head start because we got to talk at dinner.
Tell us a little bit, if you would, about the Hoover Commission, which was that post?
There are two. Which one?
Well, there you go. Summarize both.
So the Hoover Commission was fantastic. It was a great example of I think fundamentally Hoover's philosophy about government changed after the New Deal. I think he was more of an activist when he was a Commerce Secretary, and I think the way that FDR, in his view, sort of shoved the New Deal down the throats of the American people, and he fundamentally changed the relationship between the federal government, the growth of federal government, and individuals. In that massive expansion of federal government, it turned out the executive branch was a mess. It was completely, it had grown so much, but it was also made no sense. There's a lot of duplicity between different agencies. It had grown into this sort of behemoth that, or Leviathan if you want, that frankly everybody could see and everybody could tell and needed to be reorganized. And somehow Hoover, even though he was so tainted politically, this is actually an amazing story. Harry Truman became one of Herbert Hoover's best friends. And the reason they became such close friends is because Hoover was sent out into the desert after FDR is elected, and FDR is in the presidency for 12 years. As the end of World War II comes about, FDR's staff is starting to say, we're going to have a food crisis in Europe, and we're going to need somebody who knows how to handle a food crisis in Europe, so we probably ought to start back-channeling to Hoover to see if he wants to help out. And FDR is quoted by one of his top staffers as saying, I'm not going to raise Jesus Christ from the dead. So it's Truman who is so offended. He has this lovely Midwestern sensibility, and he's so offended by how Hoover is treated by FDR that within 5 days of becoming president of the United States, he handwrites Hoover a note. He wants to actually send him a letter and invite him to the Oval Office to help figure out the food situation in Europe, and actually what happens is his staff says, that's a terrible idea, you can't do that. So he handwrites a note and gives it to an usher who takes it off White House grounds and mails it to Hoover at the Waldorf Astoria where he's living in his post-presidency. Hoover receives it and goes down and meets with Truman within 48 hours. And they begin this friendship. He goes around the world and figures out the food situation and is able to actually visit 70 countries and actually administer and oversee food relief in the post-World War era, and then is brought back into public life. And people remember him. And because Truman's putting his arm around him, Truman's okay, Hoover is kind of, and FDR is gone, Hoover gets another look. And Truman recognizes that the federal government has grown so much, it absolutely needs to be reorganized. And Hoover was known as this incredibly efficient and effective manager of massive operations and organizations. And because he had a bipartisan Congress at the time, he figured that he needed a Republican to help put his name on a legislation that would then, a commission that would have to pass the House and the Senate in order to make recommendations that would then reorganize the federal government and reorganize specifically the executive branch. And so he calls up Hoover, and the Hoover Commission, the first one, is implemented by Truman, and then the second one is done by Eisenhower. And there are two commissions that essentially play off of each other, reorganize the federal government. They offer, I don't know, 50 or 70 recommendations for how you would streamline the executive branch in the federal government in order to make it more efficient. And then those recommendations, 80% of them end up being adopted. And so the way we understand the federal government now in terms of its executive agencies and the White House is actually a product of the Hoover Commission that Eisenhower and Truman in sequence implemented. Yes. Or should I go to somebody else and then do a follow up? Go, yeah, follow up.
This is more of a gossipy thing. What, did you have, are there any personal letters from Hoover that talked about MacArthur
General MacArthur?
Right.
Oh, there's more than that.
Oh,
General MacArthur
but
lived
things
upstairs.
Things that we won't read in the history
General
books.
MacArthur lived in 32A at the Waldorf Astoria. Herbert Hoover's in 31A. Herbert Hoover's the 31st president, so it seems only fitting he would live on the 31st floor of the Waldorf Astoria. But my dad lived with him for a year, and MacArthur came down all the time. He actually taught my dad how to make a flank with his toy soldiers the right way, because MacArthur did know something about how you flank the opposing army. Gossip about MacArthur. I mean, look, there are historians who think that the biggest mistake Herbert Hoover actually made in his presidency had nothing to do with anything related to the Great Depression, but was not firing General MacArthur after the bonus march. Because the bonus marchers, who were World War I veterans, who wanted their bonuses early because of the Great Depression, because 25% of the country was out of work, which meant 25% of men were out of work, and marched on Washington in order to get their veterans' bonuses early, were camped out in the hills of Anacostia, and Hoover had to call the military in because it looked like things could become not peaceful. And what people don't know is that Hoover and his wife privately paid for aid and tents and food to be built in the Anacostia Flats in order to house the bonus marchers. He anonymously provided that on the side while still being the face of the bad guy who wasn't going to grant the bonus marchers their money. And a havoc broke out, and MacArthur ordered that one of his soldiers fire, and actually one of the bonus marchers was killed. And that was maybe a clear early case of not listening to the chain of command. And MacArthur ran into that kind of trouble later in his life too. And so there's an argument that maybe we would have been spared or maybe Truman would have been spared MacArthur's trouble in Korea had it not been had he had been caught earlier in his career. MacArthur did many important and historic achievements in those intervening years. So I think that's probably an overstatement. But they remained very good friends, actually, and they were very collegial. I mean, they were, I don't have any good gossip because, my dad is 9 and he's teaching him to play with toy soldiers, so I just didn't think he had the sensibility to see anything and then tell me. And to the extent that we have letters, they'll be in the Presidential Library in Iowa. So I could give you the archivist there, and he could give you some of the MacArthur letters. Are you looking for anything in particular?
No, just gossip.
Just gossip.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
No students. To go off your grandfather and go to one of your last points.
Yeah.
What would you say a conservative, libertarian approach to climate change might be? What are the principles?
Well, it's interesting. I had, as I mentioned, I just can't get this Mike Bloomberg thing out of my head because I just spent this day with him yesterday. I spent an hour with him yesterday. He spent a lot of time with me. And his view is that actually the businesses are doing it by themselves in this country. The businesses are, we have CAFE standards that are helping emissions and keeping emissions lower, but that frankly, between the development of new technologies, development of nuclear power, this is my view, right? And frankly, investing in nuclear power, I think the conservative approach to climate change in reducing our carbon emissions is to triple down on nuclear. As well as some of these other new technologies. We have to invest in these new technologies. Everybody is, I'm not as into wind and solar as everybody else is because the majority of wind and solar growth, much of it is compensated by the federal government. There are tax credits that are going to many of these countries in order to build these solar farms that in many cases, what we all know about wind and solar is you can't store the energy. And the technology isn't even close to being there to be able to store the energy. So while I don't have anything against it in the places where it makes sense and when you actually can generate the energy, I think the easiest thing to do is to get rid of the red tape around nuclear and to in this one and only way, be France. Be more like France.
Hi, Ms. Hoover. I was wondering, who's your favorite guest that you've had on your show?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. Thanks for asking. I have a list of all my guests right here. I'm going to go through them really quick and look. Look, I have admiration for a lot of the folks that I had on. I really liked Ben Sass. I really liked Paul Ryan. I really like... Look, I'll tell you who I don't really like. You want gossip? Yes. You know, look, I think his biography is fantastic. Julian Castro has like a great biography. But let me just tell you, this guy has, I mean, you know, Trump, now I'm like channeling Trump. Low energy, Jeb. Like, Julian Castro has no energy. Like, no energy at all. Like, I couldn't believe after sitting there with him for 45 minutes, because it's a 26-minute show, 26 minutes and 45 seconds, but we tape long and then we slice it down. Like, no energy. God, I love Jim Mattis. I had Jim Mattis 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he is an extraordinary human being. I had Condi on a couple weeks ago. Condi, I mean, I think Condi's a star. Condoleezza Rice is an extraordinary personal biography. And I love H.R. McMaster. H.R. McMaster is just a really thoughtful, cerebral. Here's one of the things we've done. Look, the litmus test for the show is you have to be relevant to public policy, public affairs in some way. That's why you get invited on. And as we're a new show, right? There's an old legacy, but we're a new show. You know, we have to have people on that are recognizable, that people know who they are. So for the most part, that's been the case. I mean, we all know who Jamie Kirchick is, but America doesn't know who Jamie Kirchick is. Jamie Kirchick is a Yale grad who ran an outside alumni campaign in order to have a voice for conservatives on the board of trustees here at Yale. Jamie was my second or third guest, and he was so much fun, and I adore him, and I read everything he writes because he's a brilliant writer. But for the most part, they're household names. There have to be people that people know who they are. So what's happened is in 4 cases, the guest has actually been a return guest to Firing Line. They were on Buckley's program, and they've come back, and so I play their clip for them. And in the case of H.R. McMaster, I mean, it was extraordinary. He was on in 1998. You could tell Buckley hadn't read the book because he was there talking about Dereliction of Duty, which was the book that H.R. wrote when he was doing his dissertation in history at UNC Chapel Hill about the dereliction of duty of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't, in his view, responsibly serve up to the American people or to the political leaders during the Vietnam War the facts as they saw them. And H.R. was on 20 years later, having served in the same position that he wrote about, giving his view about how the National Security Agency works. And as a political appointee, he was in a different perspective because his book is really a criticism of the Joint Chiefs. And he serves as a political appointee, but with the background of a 3-star general. So that part's really fun because there's somebody who's still relevant to current events, but who's been on the show before, and it frankly was able to opine and reflect on the position that he held, that he also had an expertise in that was profiled in the first show. So for me, that's the most fun because you're just drawing on, you know, a rich well of history. Yeah, let me do this one and then I'll come back to you.
Teamwork. Okay. Thanks so much for coming. My question is to follow up on something you said towards the end of how the Republican Party can adapt to essentially this new lexicon around identity politics.
Yes.
And I'm really curious just to hear more of your thoughts on that and how we can do that. I think especially just speaking as a Yale student, that's something that every single classroom, every single conversation, it's a part of.
I know.
Yeah.
So I really feel for you. I mean, because I almost hesitated to mention it here on a college campus because I really believe that race has been so weaponized, especially on college campuses, in a way that's like even hard for me to understand because I was in college 20 years ago, God forbid. It's crazy. But I was here, and campus life, while politicized and while certainly professors had liberal bents, and you had to, if you were from the right, sort of think through how you were going to engage, I think it's nothing like what you guys are dealing with. And so I actually took some notes about this because I think here it's a lot harder. I think in an environment that is so polarized, frankly, and so stacked against, in many cases, a really thoughtful and civil exchange of ideas that that is safe, actually, because certain issues have become so weaponized that, and because I think there is a chill about what can be said and what ideas can be expressed, you just have a harder time being able to engage on these issues. But I mean, you see the same thing happening at the New York Times, frankly. I have conservative friends who write at the New York Times, and they can't have these conversations either, which is also not good. So hence the free speech movement, or the resurrection of the sort of free speech movement. All of that aside, there are issues that are correct, I mean, that have been raised about sort of the legacy, the ways in which, you know, the legacy of slavery, our original sin, still continues to persist in everyday life, in urban areas, in the fact that, you know, it's black and brown children who don't have access to the best education. They have access to the worst education, and they have access to the least opportunities, and the worst infrastructure, and the worst housing, and the most leaded water. And you know, and it's not a direct line to slavery in every case, right? But there is a legacy of a lack of opportunity around certain people of color in this country that is a conversation that I don't see why conservatives shouldn't engage in when we're able to engage in a fair and safe way that doesn't weaponize it, and then doesn't silence people who want to engage and try to constructively solve these problems, right? I think, you know, the safest and easiest place for conservatives to go is education reform, right, and competition education. But there's more. There's more that we should do if the environment weren't so toxic. And so I can't give you advice on how to do it here, because this is a really different place than when I was in college. But as a movement, there's no reason to not sort of engage the activism of the left that I think is in some cases sort of justly founded, and to try to come up with conservative solutions that lead to greater equality of opportunity for all Americans, including those that don't have it because of that history.
Hello. Speaking about a lot of those concerns about, obviously, the issues of our day, identity issues and stuff like that, what do you think would be the perspective a lot of those type of people in kind of the mainstream media discourse would have on Herbert Hoover, given the fact that Hoover didn't really have orthodox views that would be considered orthodox today on immigration and things like that? Can you speak to what would Hoover say today about our immigration debates, given his views historically?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, actually. I'm gonna go out on a limb, because anybody who would get mad at me is either dead or I could ask for forgiveness. I have some papers from Hoover about immigration that were never turned over to our presidential library, and it was a correspondence between a senator from California and Hoover in the 1940s about how you could have an improved worker visa program that would account for people coming in to work seasonally and be sort of like a truce between labor, because labor was against it. Big labor was against worker, like a guest worker program coming in because they wanted to protect the jobs, they were protectionists. So, I mean, I think Hoover was essentially a free marketer who, I mean, I think is probably in line with the conservative position today, to the extent that the conservative position says you need to know who's coming in, protect the border, but allow for people to come in a way that is complementary to our economic climate, and be thoughtful about it. And in the case of those papers, they were addressing a specific problem in terms of a dearth of labor in California, in the farms in the 1940s. So that's the best I can do on what Hoover thought about immigration. But I think essentially most people in this country, but certainly conservatives, I am more of a, look, I worked in the Bush White House. I was a Marco Rubio primary voter in 2016. I believe that we have to have borders. I believe everything I wrote in my book, which is that we have to have borders. I saw it right back there. I still believe it, even though it's 10 years old. You have to have borders, and you have to secure your borders. But we also have to have a way to be able to incorporate in our economy places where we need and can use the help of immigrants. And I fundamentally think that draws on the traditions, the best traditions of this country.
That's going to be it. Thank you, Ms. Hoover. I hope you all join me.